When you stop trying, God starts working. This truth may sound simple, but it carries a deep spiritual mystery that can change your life completely. Many people are exhausted, not because they are lazy, but because they are trying too hard in their own strength. They pray, but they also worry. They believe, but they also struggle. They trust God with their words, yet their hearts are still heavy with pressure. They say, God, I surrender, but their hands are still gripping the situation tightly. This is where faith becomes blocked. God never asked us to carry what only He can carry. There comes a moment in every believer's life when human effort reaches its limit. You have planned, pushed, struggled, and done everything you know to do, and still nothing changes. That moment is not failure, it is an invitation. It is God saying, now let me take over. As long as you are trying to be the source, God remains the helper. But when you finally surrender, God becomes the source. Faith does not mean doing nothing, it means trusting completely. True faith rests, it releases control. It says, Lord, I cannot, but you can. When you stop forcing doors, God begins opening doors no man can shut. When you stop striving in fear, God begins moving in power. When you stop relying on your strength, God releases His supernatural strength. Many blessings are delayed not because God is unwilling, but because we are unwilling to let go. We want miracles, but we also want control. Yet control is the enemy of faith. God works best in surrendered hearts. When Abraham stopped trying to help God fulfill the promise, Isaac was born. When Moses stopped depending on his ability, the Red Sea opened. When the disciples stopped panicking and trusted Jesus, the storm obeyed His voice. God is not moved by your stress, He is moved by your faith. Worry never solved a problem, but faith has moved mountains. The moment you stop saying, I must fix this, and start saying, God, I trust you, heaven begins to move on your behalf. Angels respond to faith, not anxiety. The Holy Spirit works where there is rest, not panic. Some of you are tired today because you are carrying burdens you were never meant to carry. God is saying to you now, give it to me. Your future, your finances, your family, your health, place it all in His hands. When you stop trying to manipulate the outcome, God begins arranging things perfectly. His timing is always right. His ways are always higher. Do not be afraid to rest in God. Rest is not weakness, it is confidence. It declares, my God is working even when I cannot see it. When you stop trying in the flesh, God starts working in the Spirit. And when God works, no force on earth can stop what He has planned for your life. Human effort has limits, but God's power has no limit. This is one of the most difficult truths for people to accept, especially in a world that teaches us to rely on hard work, intelligence, and personal strength. From a young age, we are taught that if we push harder, plan better, and try longer, we will succeed. While effort has its place, there comes a point where no amount of human strength can produce the breakthrough we are seeking. At that moment, frustration grows, exhaustion sets in, and hope begins to fade. This is not a sign that God has abandoned you. It is evidence that you have reached the edge of your own ability. When your strength ends, God's supernatural work begins. God never intended for human effort to replace divine power. He allows us to reach our limits so that we can recognize our need for Him. Many times we pray for God to act, yet we continue to depend on our own understanding and resources. As long as we are strong in ourselves, we leave little room for God to display His strength. But when we admit, I cannot do this anymore, something shifts in the spiritual realm. that confession of weakness becomes an invitation for God's power to move. God specializes in situations where human solutions fail. He steps in where logic ends, where doors are closed, and where possibilities seem impossible. When you stop depending on what you can do and begin trusting what God can do, the impossible becomes possible. Your limit becomes the starting point for God's unlimited power. As long as you try to control everything, God remains only a helper, not the source. Many believers unknowingly treat God as a backup plan instead of the foundation of their lives. They pray first, but then they rush to fix the situation themselves. They ask God for guidance, yet they rely more on their own decisions than on His direction. This creates inner conflict because the heart says, trust God, while the mind insists on staying in control. Faith cannot fully operate in an environment where control is still in human hands. God never competes with human control. He waits, He honors free will, and He allows us to choose whether we will depend on ourselves or surrender to Him. As long as you insist on managing the outcome, God will assist you only to the extent you allow Him. But when you release control completely, something powerful happens. God steps in as the source. When God becomes the source, provision flows without strain, guidance comes without confusion, and peace replaces anxiety. Surrender does not mean irresponsibility, it means alignment. It means placing your plans under God's authority and trusting Him with the results. When you stop trying to force things to work, God begins arranging circumstances beyond your ability. He connects the right people, opens the right doors, and closes the wrong ones without struggle. The moment you let go of control is the moment divine order begins. When God is the source, you are no longer carrying the weight alone. He carries it for you. True faith is not found in constant striving or restless effort. It is found in rest. Many people believe faith means trying harder, praying louder, or doing more spiritual activities, but real faith flows from trust, not tension. When a person truly believes God, there is an inner calm that settles in the heart. That calm is not laziness or passivity. It is confidence in God's ability to do what He has promised. Rest is the evidence that faith is alive. Striving often comes from fear. The fear that if you stop pushing, everything will fall apart. But faith says the opposite. Even when I stop, God continues. Whoa. When you trust God's timing, you no longer rush ahead of Him or lag behind in doubt. You move in peace, knowing that delays do not mean denial and silence does not mean absence. God is working even when you cannot see immediate results. Resting in God also protects your spiritual strength. Constant stress weakens faith, clouds judgment, and steals joy. But when you choose to rest, your heart becomes sensitive to God's voice. You begin to recognize His direction more clearly because your spirit is not crowded with anxiety. Faith-filled rest allows God to work deeply within you, changing not only your situation but also your character. When you rest in God's promises, you declare that His word is more reliable than circumstances. That rest creates space for divine intervention. God works most powerfully in hearts that trust Him enough to stop striving and start believing. Worry quietly blocks the flow of faith and prevents spiritual progress. Many people do not realize that worry is not just an emotion, it is a signal of misplaced trust. When the mind is filled with anxious thoughts, the heart struggles to believe that God is in control. You may still pray and speak faith-filled words, but inwardly, worry creates resistance. It divides the heart between trust and fear, making it difficult for faith to operate freely. Surrender, on the other hand, opens the door for miracles. When you release your fears into God's hands, you create space for His power to move. God does not work through panic. He works through peace. Worry keeps you focused on the problem, but surrender shifts your focus to God. This shift is where breakthroughs begin. The moment you stop replaying worst-case scenarios in your mind and start trusting God with the outcome, spiritual momentum is restored. Worry drains spiritual energy, while surrender restores it. Anxiety keeps you awake at night, but surrender gives rest to your soul. When you surrender, you are not ignoring reality. You are choosing to believe that God is greater than reality. Miracles are born in surrendered hearts because surrender allows God to act without resistance. When worry leaves, faith grows stronger. Guidance becomes clearer, decisions become wiser, and peace guards your heart. Surrender does not change God's power. It changes your position to receive what He is already willing to give. God moves most powerfully in hearts that are fully surrendered. Many people desire God's intervention, yet they hesitate to release control. They want divine help without personal surrender. However, God's work is not activated by ability, intelligence, or effort. It is activated by trust. A surrendered heart tells God, I depend on you completely. That posture of dependence invites divine movement beyond human understanding. Letting go of control is not easy because control gives a false sense of security. People believe that if they manage everything, they can prevent disappointment. But control often produces anxiety, not peace. When you surrender, you exchange anxiety for assurance. You stop trying to predict every outcome and begin trusting God's wisdom. This is where faith becomes real, not in words, but in posture. God honors surrender because it acknowledges His authority. When you surrender your plans, your timelines, and your expectations, God begins to reshape them according to His purpose. He sees what you cannot see and knows what you do not know. A surrendered heart allows God to work deeply, not only changing circumstances, but also transforming desires and attitudes. Beyond human understanding, God begins to orchestrate events in ways you could never plan. He aligns situations, people, and opportunities effortlessly. What once felt impossible starts unfolding naturally. This is not coincidence, it is divine order. When you let go, God steps in. When you surrender, heaven responds. God's greatest works are revealed not in controlled lives, but in surrendered ones. When you stop forcing outcomes and choose to trust God fully, life begins to move according to a higher order. Forcing things often comes from impatience and fear. The fear that if you do not act quickly, you will miss your opportunity. But God is never late, and He is never rushed. Trusting Him means believing that His timing is perfect, even when it does not match your expectations. When you release the pressure to make things happen, you allow God to work in ways far beyond your planning. Trust shifts the burden from your shoulders to God's hands. You no longer exhaust yourself trying to open doors that God has not ordained. Instead, you begin to notice doors opening naturally, without struggle or compromise. God arranges your life with precision, placing you in the right position at the right time. What you could not achieve through effort alone begins to unfold through grace. When God is arranging your life, even delays serve a purpose. What feels like waiting is often preparation. God uses these moments to protect you from wrong choices and prepare you for greater blessings. Trust allows you to remain peaceful during the process, knowing that nothing is wasted in God's plan. As you trust God fully, clarity replaces confusion. Decisions become guided, relationships align, and purpose becomes clearer. You realize that God's will is not something you must chase. It is something that meets you when you walk in trust.